Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
We don't know if he tried to kill her or whether she died by accident, although I would say the last offence he committed, the little 9-year-old girl, and his photographic memory got him convicted, so you would fully expect him to learn from that and not let the second child live.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martyn Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
We may be a new podcast on the scene, but we've already entered the True Crime Awards. We've entered our show into the Outstanding Indie Podcast category. We're going to find out if we're nominated in mid-March. The awards take place in June. Of course, we will keep you updated. And I hear that Howard Soons, who was in our very first episode on Fred and Rose West, is going to be attending as a special guest. Martyn, you've attended as a special guest before too, I hear.
I have, and I have to say the True Crime Awards are the only place to go for anybody interested in everything about true crime.
In this second episode on the abduction and murder of 8-year-old Sara Payne in Sussex in July 2000, we're going to find out how detectives' prime suspect, 41-year-old Roy Whiting, was brought to justice thanks to painstaking forensic investigation. And we'll be discussing the important legacy of this case. In a moment, we'll be speaking again to Detective Inspector Martyn Underhill, who was the Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case. But first, Martyn, just remind us of the actual story.
This was a huge crime story that really dominated the headlines through the summer of 2000. And I covered it for Sky News from the beginning to the end. Sara Payne was 8 years old. She was playing hide-and-seek with her 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, in a cornfield close to the Sussex coast. It was the first weekend of the summer school holidays. She had an accident. She hurt her head and ran crying back towards her grandparents' home just a few minutes away, and she was never seen alive again.
What happened after Sara was reported missing?
Police scoured the area. They leapt into action very, very early on. They took witness statements. One of the key witnesses was her older brother, Lee, who wasn't far behind her when she ran out of the field. In fact, it was about 13 seconds before he emerged through the hedge behind his sister. Now, Lee remembered a white van speeding through the lane and its rather unkempt driver grinning at him. In fact, his description was quite detailed. He talked about a scruffy man with white stubble on his face, yellow teeth. Police put this description together and created a computer-generated image of the man that became the suspect. Police called on known local sex offenders, and one of them was Roy Whiting, who happened to own a white van, had a dodgy alibi, and behaved oddly when police approached him. They arrested him less than 24 hours after Sara disappeared, but didn't yet have the evidence to charge him, so they had to release him on bail. Then, after 2 weeks of public appeals and searching, on the 17th of July, Sara's body was discovered in a shallow grave near Pulborough, about 18 miles from where she was taken.
Thanks, Martyn. Well, let's bring in DI Martyn Underhill again. Tosh to his fellow officers and reporters and mates. Tosh, welcome back to True Criminals. I really just want to say it's fantastic to have you with us, to get your insight on such an important story.
Thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me. I've enjoyed it, and it's particularly nice to bounce stuff around with Martyn. We've known each other a long time because of this case.
Roy Whiting was the man who eventually was found guilty of murdering Sara. He came onto your radar very early on, in fact, the night that Sara had gone missing. What happened when he was originally questioned and arrested the day after she went missing?
Whiting went no comment, was very uncooperative, which we didn't expect, to be fair, because we knew in previous arrests he had spoken about his offending behaviour. With no comment, we had no forensic evidence at that stage, and we had no real provenance of the white van he said he bought 2 days before. We literally had to release him, which I lost sleep about, and so did Anne Madley, because of his offending history and this case. And we had to accept there was a chance that Sarah had been abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered. I lost sleep over releasing him, but we had to. So we released him and waited for a breakthrough. And the breakthrough took a long time to come, actually, but the good news is that he committed another offence. He stole a car, which put him in prison and left the public safe.
Tosh, let's talk about the investigation and the forensic science that you had to pursue. You said in the past that it wasn't a difficult case from a detection point of view, but even though you were pretty convinced Roy Whiting had abducted and killed Sarah, you still had to prove it in a court, and the key was the forensic evidence. And one of the first key elements of that was the discovery of one of Sarah's shoes. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so on the 17th day, a phone call came into the incident room. Sarah had just been found in a grave near the A29. And a member of the public phoned up and said, I should have made the phone call when she went missing, but it was so far away from where she was, I didn't think it was relevant. And the call handler said, what are you referring to? And she said, well, on the Saturday night, it must have been about 9 or 10 o'clock, I was driving home, it was just got dark, and she had my headlights on, and I saw a little child's shoe in the middle of Coolham Crossroads, which I thought was odd, but it was so far away from the missing girl, I didn't think about it. But I just heard on the news that you found her body 2 miles away from Coolham. So this became known as the Coolham shoe, and we rushed officers up there to find that shoe, and it took a long time to find a shoe because we reckon 3, 4, 5, 6,000 cars had run over that shoe, and over time moved it further down the road. So the cars had moved the shoe about 100 yards away from Coolham Crossroads, but we did find the shoe and very quickly established this is the same size and colour as the shoe missing from Sarah. So we took the shoe in a plastic bag to Sarah and Michael, and Sarah immediately burst into tears and said, that's the shoe. The key part of that exhibit, the Coolham shoe, which was the most important exhibit, bar one in the case, was it was a Velcro shoe. And if any of your listeners know about the properties of Velcro, forensically, it's an absolute dream. Forensically, you struggle to find anything better than Velcro to capture forensic evidence, because she had a Velcro strap on the top. That's 2 bits of Velcro which match and join up to link the shoe. And those two produced Aladdin's cave of forensic evidence from soil, which later we established came from the field she was playing in, from fibres, from Whiting and from Sarah, a piece of hair that related back to Sarah. And the interesting backstory to this shoe, which was the second key exhibit in the case, the backstory to this was, how did that shoe end up at Coolham Crossroads? And I can only assume that Sarah, who was a really nousy, quite grown-up girl for 8, had thrown that shoe out. She was throwing stuff out the window to try and tell people where she was being taken. I can't think of any other reason why that shoe would have been in Coolham Crossroads.
I thought a theory at the time was this was Whiting having killed Sarah with the body in the van, panicking and trying to get rid of evidence. But you've surprised me with that theory now.
It's the theory I've always had, to be honest, but Alan and Peter both ran down he's throwing it out to get rid of evidence. He was too forensically aware to do that, Martyn. The reason we didn't find him on the Saturday night when the officers went to find him, and on the Sunday morning, because they had to go back twice, was because he was forensically steam cleaning the back of the van to get away all the forensic evidence in relation to Sarah. Someone who's that forensically aware and has been convicted before on forensic evidence found in a car, I just can't see he did that. So it's my personal view. I think Sarah was trying to alert people as to where she was. But whether the offender threw it out or she threw it out, it was the only item of her clothing we ever found. And we searched for a long, long time for her clothing. I can remember before the trial, after the murder, but before the trial, I think it was November, that year, we had a torrential storm that caused massive flooding up near the gravesite. And we actually sent a search team out to see if that had dug up Sarah's clothes for us to be able to use forensically. So we were searching for those clothes for many, many months.
Tosh, tell us about Whiting's van. Presumably, police carried out extensive forensic tests, and although he cleaned it, did the van give you forensic evidence?
It did. It gave us two very key pieces of evidence. One was there was a red sweatshirt on the seat next to the driver and a clown curtain. And the red sweatshirt was sent straight to the lab. But frustratingly, hindsight's a wonderful thing, the DNA came back within 3 weeks saying, it's got Whiting's DNA on it, so we can prove the sweatshirt is Whiting if he denies being in that van. But frustratingly, the scientists didn't prioritise it for hair. That came as a second round of forensic examinations. And ultimately, when they did do it, I remember the phone call vividly. Peter Kennett and I were taking the Payne family out for Christmas lunch. It was a week before Christmas. We met them. We were in a nice restaurant and we were basically updating them on the case and said, I'm sorry, but we still haven't been able to prove this yet. And unbelievably, because I thought it was a setup, Peter Kennett's phone rings, it's the lab, and they said, we've got some really exciting news. We found Sara Payne's head hair on Whiting's red sweatshirt. And that was the piece of the jigsaw we didn't have. And so the sweatshirt found in the van, he steam cleaned the back of the van, which is where, in hindsight, I think he attacked her after he'd pulled over and took out the footwell and put her in the back of the van. But he didn't remove his sweatshirt, which had her head hair on. The other thing that was found in the van was a pair of socks, which DNA told us were Whiting's. And we believe he used those as gloves. And there were fibres from those socks found in the Coulomb shoe. And there were some of Sarah's DNA, plus her head hair, I think, in the Coulomb shoe, plus soil from the abduction site. So there was a myriad of forensic evidence that we created a chart to show to the jury because it was confusing. There were so many different exhibits linking in. For example, we struggled to put Sarah in his van, but 2 days before she went missing, she wore a blue school coat, a sort of silver grey blue school coat that had just been bought for her. And she left that in the car when she went for a weekend with her grandparents. And cross-fibre transference allowed fibres from that coat to transfer to her blue dress, which then transferred into the Coulomb shoe. So the Coulomb shoe had evidence of Sarah's coat, not the clothes she was wearing on the night. So it was quite confusing. We had to do several charts for the jury to explain how things got transferred. But we were very able to, at length in the trial, show the jury categorically we can put Sarah to Whiting, we can put Whiting to Sarah, we can put Sarah to the abduction site, and we can put Whiting to the deposition site, which was enormous. I can honestly say, every case you take to court, you think you're going to lose. I have a case on Sky Documentaries at the moment where I was convinced I would lose it because it was purely circumstantial murder. But I had no doubts whatsoever that this case would be a conviction. The evidence was so strong.
You also had, of course, strong circumstantial evidence.
Yes, we did. And interestingly, talking about circumstantial evidence, I tried to get his previous offence admitted to the court, but I failed. The judge ultimately said, you've got enough evidence to convict here. You don't need to give this man a reason for appeal. And if you use similar fact evidence, you're immediately giving him a right to appeal. So for your listeners, he committed a very similar offence to this 5 years before. He tried to abduct 3 little girls in Crawley. He was driving a red Sierra, and 2 of the girls got away and he grabbed one of them. And that girl was thrown in the car, driven to a wood, sexually abused, and then dumped naked in a side street, and he drove off. His biggest mistake with that offence was he didn't realise who he was dealing with. This little girl, she was 9, had photographic memory, and she remembered everything, from a Southern FM sticker in the front windscreen to a little metal bauble hanging from the mirror to a scuff mark on the rear wing. She gave 8 identifying features of that car. She was an amazing witness. And The car was found very quickly because of everything she remembered. She remembered the part index of the car as well. The car was recovered 2 days after the attack, and Whiting was arrested the day after that. And he openly admitted the offence. He tried to minimise the offence, saying it wasn't a sexual assault, but he admitted abducting and assaulting the girl. And there were a lot of similarities. Before he abducted the girl in Crawley and before he abducted Sarah Payne, he went sick with a twisted gut. Before he abducted the girl in Crawley, before he abducted Sara Payne, he had a haircut and cleaned his hair. He was always notoriously dirty. And between both offences, just before, he removed himself from everybody socially. So neighbours didn't see him, nobody saw him. He became incommunicado 24 hours before he committed both offences. So that's the first offence. I wasn't allowed to introduce it into evidence, which was interesting. I've never tried to argue for similar fact before, but actually looking back on it, the judge was right. The evidence was so strong. I didn't need to introduce the similar evidence. But of course, as Martyn will recall in a minute, when the previous conviction was read out in the court, you could cut the end of the knife, and the jury, I think without fail, every one of them cried.
And the stuff you found in his van was pretty damning, wasn't it? The rapist kit.
Yes, in the rear of the van, we did find what you could call a rapist kit, which was tape, gloves, I think it was a knife or a screwdriver. He, of course, still refused to comment, but when he went to trial, had an explanation for what I would call that rape kit, as Martyn called it. But we did have strong evidence, and we had a lot of corroboration because we introduced the 7 members of the public who saw this white van act suspiciously. We were able to detail to the jury, without them knowing he had a previous conviction, that he was a very unstable character who was in the right place at the wrong time from our point of view, but in his case, in the right place at the right time to abduct a little girl. And don't forget, we had that CD film I mentioned earlier. That was very similar to Whiting, and that was introduced in court to show this is who Lee thought was driving the white van.
Tosh, it seems perhaps appropriate to ask, just before we launch into more details about the trial itself, can you give us a sense of what you believe happened to Sarah from the moment she was parted from her siblings? What happened as she popped through that hedge?
I thought that she was throwing the stuff out the windows far later on, North Sussex, which means that she survived for a considerable time after being abducted. We know because Lee saw a white van driving down a country road. The roof was above the hedge, and we know it stopped briefly and then drove off. So we know that Sarah went in that van, and we know she was in the footwell because Lee said the van stopped for about 5 seconds. So you wouldn't have time to open back doors, put someone in the back of the van. So we know that she went in the front and the van drove off. He then at some stage has transferred her from the footwell to the rear of the van because we know the rape kit was in the back of the van, for example. And he steam cleaned to an inch of his life the rear of the van, not the front. So we know the assault, it's a fair assumption the assault took part in the back. And we don't know when that happened. And my original view was that he pulled into a lay-by. There were 32 sightings of white vans within a 10-mile radius of the abduction. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to think he pulled over 4 miles away, took the girl, Sarah, into the back of the van and assaulted her, and she died during that assault. That was my original theory, so that she went to Buck Barn, filled up with diesel with a dead child in the boot, turned left again, and deposited the body. And that's why I think all my other colleagues disagree with me and say, well, that's what happened, and that's why he was throwing evidence out the window. I just struggle with someone who's so forensically aware that he would have thrown forensic gold mines out of a window because the Cullen shoe became the second key exhibit. So I don't know. I honestly don't know where she was assaulted and where she died.
Tosh, I don't know either, but I tend to disagree in theory, and who am I to disagree with a seasoned murder investigator? But my only thought is that would you stop to refuel and leave your van with a child you've kidnapped in the back who, if she's still alive, would, you'd have thought, be banging on the van and shouting and screaming and likely to draw attention to herself?
Yeah, I agree. I'm not saying my theory stands up to scrutiny. It's just something I've always thought. But equally, if you had done a slick operation of just driving aimlessly, waiting for a child to present itself, which Sarah did, you wouldn't have had a van that needed petrol in it, would you? You would have made sure you had a full tank. So we can't second guess all these things, can we?
But isn't it a theory of child sex abductors, or a theory of those who investigate it, that those kind of crimes are carried out by criminals living out a fantasy, and it's at the moment where they commit the rape and the murder that they kind of come back into real life and they panic, and that's why evidence gets scattered? I mean, that's what other investigators have told me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, because of his twisted gut and he cut himself off from society for 24 hours, he was building up to abducting and hurting a little girl. It just was pure fluke that it was Sara Payne on that day. But you're right, he was so driven by his sexual urges that logic went until the murders happened. We don't know if he tried to kill her or whether she died by accident, although I would say the last offence he committed, the little 9-year-old girl, and his photographic memory was such that got him convicted. So you'd fully expect him to learn from that and not let the second child live.
Tell us about the expert that you consulted who deals with pollen and things like that, and how valuable her findings were in this case.
Yeah, so this is Professor Pat Wiltshire, and we engaged with her because of the family. You're always trying to satisfy a family's needs, and the family became completely dominated by the view: was my daughter alive when she was taken to the deposition site? Did he bury her alive? If she died before she was buried, when did she die? How long did this nightmare last for my little girl? And the obvious way to prove that was two things: soil and pollen. Because where Sarah was abducted was a barley field, and where Sarah was deposited was a grass field with ragwort in it where horses grazed. Hugely different, and the soil was massively different too. The abduction site was very chalky and loamy, and the deposition site was very clayey. So we knew that one of those two would give us an answer, and Pat was asked, she specialises in pollen and also in all plants, but mainly pollen. And she found pollen in the upper nasal cavity of Sarah from the abduction site. So we could definitely put Sarah in the field, and she didn't find any pollen from the deposition site in her nose. It wasn't conclusive, but we were able to say to the family, because they really, really wanted an answer, that if you follow the logic of the forensic evidence, Sarah was dead before she got to the deposition site, which means she died reasonably quickly after being abducted, which again goes against my own argument about her throwing the shoe out the window. I get that. But she could have died at the deposition site in the van before he opened the doors. We don't know.
But details like that, Tosh, I would imagine, was so important to the Payne family, and perhaps in this dreadful, grim time offered a tiny bit of comfort to hear that you thought she died before she got to that site.
Yes, absolutely. And you have to look after the family. And that was actually one of my biggest mistakes in this case. Sara, I had a good experience with Sara from a professional point of view. We got on very well. I was her main contact part of the family liaison team. And I spoke to Sara because she wanted to go and see Sarah. And I said, Sara, I've seen your daughter. You really don't want to go there. It's an awful memory for you. And she said, well, I'll be guided by you. And so she never got to say goodbye to the Sarah that was found in the field 17 days later. And it was a horrendous sight. But that was a big mistake by me. And actually, a year later, Sara got very angry that I had stopped her saying goodbye to her daughter, rightly so. We had to get her counselling to get through that. And policing changed its position on telling families not to see mutilated or horrible decomposing corpses. And now, any family who goes through a tragedy is told, we're not giving an opinion, it's your decision if you want to go and see your child or your parent. And that change came about because I did get it wrong. I should never have said, you can't say goodbye. I didn't want her to be traumatised, but it's not my call, it's her call. And of course, she can't turn the clock back. And a year later, she really regretted not saying goodbye to her daughter in the mortuary. And I carried the blame for that.
The trial took place at Lewis Crown Court lasted 4 weeks. What are your memories of the trial, Tosh?
I have two memories, neither of which I suspect you'll expect me to say. The first one was a member of the jury who was brought by the News of the World, and we had to abort the trial on day one. And the second one was, and this links us nicely to the first offence of the 9-year-old girl in Crawley, and I don't think, Martin, I've ever told you this, the victim, the 9-year-old victim of the Crawley offence, sat next to me in the trial all the way through. The judge agreed to it, her family agreed to it, she came with her mum most days, and she was never identified, but she got the satisfaction, to use her words, of watching Martyn going down for the murder of Sara Payne, and she was his first victim. Do you remember that, Martin? Did you ever know that?
I didn't know that. I'm learning an awful lot of new stuff by talking to you so many years after. If you like the show and want to listen ad-free, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. You can now subscribe to our ad-free tier for just £4 a month and get unlimited access to our entire back catalogue, completely uninterrupted.
Or if you love the show and want to support what we do, you can become a True Criminals Insider.
For just £3 a month, becoming an insider means you're directly supporting the podcast you love. Your support helps us create even more captivating stories and dive deeper into the most gripping true crime cases. It keeps the show going and the stories alive.
So whether you want ad-free listening or to help support the show, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals and choose the option that works for you.
Thanks for listening and for all your support. We couldn't do this without you.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
I'll tell you one thing we haven't discussed is how on earth, after what he did to that little girl, how on earth was he a free man at the time of Sarah's murder?
Oh, Dad, God, bloody, have you got an hour? I'm so angry about this. That's one of the reasons I've just joined the parole board, to try and make sure the right people stay in prison. So there's two things about the first offence. He was sentenced to 3 years. I can't believe that. 3 years is nothing. When he tried to abduct 3 little girls, 2 got away, and he then took 1 little girl, sexually assaulted her, threw her out naked in a strange place. She was nowhere near where she lived. Refused to accept the sexual nature of the offence, admitted the abduction, never admitted the really nasty sexual stuff that went on, and then went to prison and pretended he was a car thief. Now, that's never been made public either. So when he goes to prison for a paedophile offence, bizarrely, nobody ever joined the dots up, and he was allowed to tell the inmates, I'm a car thief, because he was a very experienced mechanic. He used to work at Arlington Speedway, near where I lived in Helsham in East Sussex. And we interviewed people who shared cells with him, and they were gobsmacked and said, well, he always told us he's a car thief. So he was in denial. He didn't have any treatment for paedophilia. He was upheld by other convicts because he was a car thief and a good one. And he was released exactly halfway through his sentence and goes on to commit another offence. But he was classed medium risk.
And he lied during his trial, didn't he? He went in the witness box.
He went in his witness box and lied. But I've been all the way through this with you two, and this is the only time I get angry. I'm so angry, I think because I had that little 9-year-old girl who was then nearly an adult, quite elderly teenager, sitting next to me all that time in that trial without anyone else knowing. I got very angry about it, and so did she. She was really angry that what she went through, nobody learned, and he went on to do it again. And we know that the risk matrix for people coming out of prison, run by the probation service and various others, has changed dramatically because of Sara Payne, because it was wrong. He wasn't a medium risk, he was a high risk and always should have been a high risk. So, yeah, I do get angry about that. Sorry, it's the first time I got really emotional. I just get frustrated with this country. We let people out and they go on to commit further offences, and that's not how it should be.
Tosh, one thing that's really struck me, this is the first time I've met you today. I know you and Martyn have known each other a very long time, but what's really struck me is the work that police do that we don't know about. You know, you mentioned at one point you were out for Christmas lunch with the family. Your duty of care goes way beyond your paycheck. You're sitting there with this 9-year-old victim of Roy Whiting by your side. You manage to conceal her identity so that she can get some feeling of satisfaction that he's going to be sent away for a long, long time. I'm slightly choked up by how you dealt with it. It was such a personal case, and I don't think the public see a lot of this kind of stuff that goes on behind the scenes.
No, but actually I can't, and thank you for what you just said. That made me emotional, but I can't finish this podcast without talking about the legacy because, and Martyn knows this, we lost a good man. We lost Michael Payne over this case. He killed himself, and that is on Roy Whiting's head.
That's Sarah's dad, isn't it? Just for clarity. What happened to him? How did Sarah's death impact, and what happened, Tosh?
Well, Michael, like many people, had quite a few mental health issues. And that's okay. And we knew about that. And he was being managed. He was on medication. But when Sarah went missing, he started drinking and smoking cannabis and taking drugs. As you would expect, his life collapsed. And that led to massive behavioural change. He got done for drink driving. At one stage, he got hold of a gun so he could kill Roy Whiting. He went off the rails a lot. But do you know what? That's okay. He's lost his daughter. I get that. Everybody got it. The family got it. We were all trying to wrap around this guy to help him cope. But going back to your point about the police do a lot more than their paycheck in looking after victims. Unfortunately, when we looked after Michael and wrapped him in cotton wool, dealt with the drink driving, dealt with him trying to get a gun to kill Roy Whiting, all that stuff until the trial. Of course, when the trial finishes, we step back, we walk away. We have to. It's just life. Family liaison officers walked away. I walked away. The supervisioners, the wraparound, Michael, dissipated, and sadly, he went on to die. And that traumatised his children, traumatised all of us, actually. It traumatised me, because that man would still be alive here today if he hadn't lost his daughter. And he was a good guy. Martyn will tell you that. He was a good guy.
We've said a lot about Sarah's family, Tosh, particularly Lee, her older brother, who played a crucial part in the trial, didn't he? How important was his evidence?
His evidence was very strong and crucial because he pieced together things really well about the white van. And it was interesting because I was in court, Martyn was in court, and I saw the jury light bulb come on. You almost saw the jury suddenly going, oh, okay, no, I get this now. It's the white van that he's driving, and that's what Lee saw going along the road. Oh, okay. And the CD fit. And they all looked at him. I remember the jury all looking at Whiting as the CD fit was shown to the jury. So Lee was massively important. And interestingly, he's one of the few members of the family I still talk to. I'm friends on Facebook with Lee. He's had his own difficult journey, as I'm sure some of you know. But Lee was really impactful and really good. And we didn't use all of the other children in the court case because we didn't want to traumatise them. And actually, they didn't bring a lot to the party. I don't mean that rudely. Lee told the jury, I'm 13 seconds behind. I'm seeing a white van. I see the white van stop. And then my sister disappears. He was crucial to the case, as was the courtroom shoe and the red sweatshirt.
How did he describe Whiting's face? Because Martyn was telling me this morning that he gave a very clear description to you of what Whiting looked like.
He did, but I've got to be honest with you, I'm going to hand over to Martyn. It's my turn.
Go on then, Martyn.
Okay, but
the CD fit, honestly, when I do talks about this murder, I put the photo of Roy Whiting on arrest alongside Lee's CD fit. It's very, very good.
Lee said he saw a man scruffy, with little white stubbles on his face, unshaven, yellowish teeth and standout white eyes. And you're right, Tosh, when that evidence was given in court, we all looked and listened and then looked across the courtroom at Whiting, and that's exactly what he looked like. And he was, in photographs, that grin came out, the grin that Lee described was absolutely Roy Whiting. And I think you're right that it was a light bulb moment for any jurors who perhaps at that stage weren't convinced of Whiting's guilt. That perhaps was the moment, or one of the moments, where they were persuaded. And of course, it was a unanimous verdict in the end.
Yes, it was. And the other thing that's never happened to me before or after, I've always remembered this, was Whiting had a fantastic, really good, top-notch barrister, a female QC, who made things uncomfortable for a few of us during the trial. Very good at her job. But two things came out after the trial. As we walked towards the public conference we were going to do, we stopped Lewis. The Lewis High Street was shut for 500 people to listen to the Payne family talking about their Sarah and Sarah's law. And as we were walking out to do that, the QC defending Whiting said, "Tosh, can I have a quick word?" And I've never, ever had this before or after. And I actually looked quite shell-shocked thinking, oh, God, she's the enemy. She's defending Whiting. What have I done? And she took me in an office and she said, "I think you were the linchpin of this case because you've changed senior officers so many times. And I think you did an outstanding job and the right man went to prison for the right offence today." And she shook my hand. And I've never, ever forgotten that. That really vindicated what we all were trying to do.
You were both there, obviously, when the guilty verdict came about. I'm going to ask Martyn, what do you remember of what the judge said when that verdict was delivered?
It had taken 4 weeks of a trial, but I think for most of us there was never any doubt what the verdict was going to be. And the judge got it absolutely right, Mr. Justice Curtis. In sentencing Whiting, he called him an evil man, a cunning and glib liar. He said to him, "You are and will remain an absolute menace to any little girl." And I couldn't help thinking at the time, why on earth didn't the judge in the first case say that to him and put him away for many, many years? And if he had, Sarah would have still been alive today. He gave Whiting life imprisonment, which was mandatory for conviction of a murder, and said it was a rare case when life should mean life. But that wasn't the end of the story when it came to Whiting's sentence, was it, Tosh? His sentence, it changed, didn't it?
It did. So two things. The thing I remember him using a phrase, because it's used too often in my view, because it was used in the Sarah trial as well. I was in Court 1 at the Old Bailey when that resolved. But he actually said, "You're every parent's nightmare." And I remember that because that is a phrase that's always now used every time a child disappears. But I don't think that was actually his summing up, but he did use the word every parent's nightmare. And no, Martyn's right. The judge gave what was effectively a life tariff. And there were only 12 people at that time in this country with a life tariff, including the Yorkshire Ripper and various others. And Whiting took this, I think he took it all the way to the European Court of Appeal, but he won the argument that actually you cannot throw the key away on anybody. The government is wrong to do that. The Home Secretary supported Justice Curtis and said this is life for life. It went all the way up to the Appeal Court. I think it ended up in the European Court. And the judiciary lost the argument. You cannot give someone a whole life tariff. So he was reduced, but he will never come out, in my view. I can't believe he'll ever come out.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? A man like that can behave like that gets a case all the way to the European Court. I know he has his right to justice as everybody else did, but the balls of it, quite frankly, having been found guilty of a crime like that is extraordinary to me. And one would hope that in prison, that now it's known that he isn't a car thief, and I'm guessing his time as a paedophile and murderer of a child has probably been quite uncomfortable, has it, Tosh?
It has. I think he has lost or nearly lost his sight in one eye. He's been, and I don't take any pleasure in this, but he's been attacked several times. He's got scars down his face and various other nasty injuries. He was stabbed in the stomach and the abdomen. He's been attacked several times. But going back to your point, I disagree with you, actually. Taking away the death sentence was a massive thing for this country. The day you say you're putting someone in prison for life and they will never, ever be allowed to be reviewed is pretty black and white for me. And I got the argument, not particularly over Whiting, over those 12, people do change. I'm not saying Whiting will. These people who had life sentences, I think as a democracy, you should never, ever close that door.
Yeah, well, actually, now you've said it like that, I think probably my gut reaction is, having sat here for the last hour hearing all the details. You just feel so passionately, don't you, for the child's family and for what happened. But you are right. People do rehabilitate, don't they? And I suppose everybody has a right to that. But you don't think he'll ever come out?
I don't think he'll ever come out. You can only rehabilitate to a certain point. When someone's committed two horrendous offences, you will never give them a chance to commit a third. I can't believe he'll ever come out. But I think the process to allow that should exist, even if it doesn't happen.
He's going to be 82 before he's eligible for parole. And given what we've just discussed about the number of attacks on him, and of course he's got to persuade the parole board when he gets to the age of 82 that he's safe to be released. And you'd have thought with these two convictions and his, as far as we know, complete refusal to acknowledge what he did and show any remorse, I just can't believe this is a man who'll ever be free.
No, I agree. I don't think he'll ever be free. There are a cadre of people who are so notorious that I don't think society, the public or anybody else or the parole board will let them out. But to end on a bit of a high, if you can finish on a high, discuss a case like this, there are so many legacies of that little girl that has changed our society, our laws, our perceptions. And I said that to Sara on the day Sarah's law went through Parliament. I know you've lost your daughter, but you've changed the world. The legacy lives on and always lives on, and I think that's massively important.
And for those, Tosh, who aren't familiar with Sarah's law, what are the key aspects of it?
So the key aspects of Sarah's law was Sara Payne asked the question, why as a parent do I not know where a paedophile lives in my area so I can risk assess my own child? And that led to a huge campaign in News of the World, which doesn't exist anymore. Over 1 million people. That's a huge amount of people. Bear in mind, we didn't have the internet then. This was paper signatures. 1 million people signed a petition to say, we need to know where our paedophiles live. And that led to Sarah's law. And that Sarah's law exists now in every part of this country. And you can walk into a police station and say, I have a 4-year-old daughter. I have 4 neighbours. I want to know if those 4 neighbours are convicted paedophiles, and the police risk assess whether to tell you or not. And that is a huge legacy, keeping hundreds, if not thousands of children safe every year because of the campaign that came from Sarah's death. We also introduced Child Rescue Alert, which was based on the American system, Amber Alert. Amber was a little girl like Sarah, abducted and murdered by the neighbour living opposite her family in America. Child Rescue Alert is still alive today. It's run by the National Crime Agency, and it's an alert system to make everyone aware a little boy or a little girl has been abducted. So that's 2 really good examples of how Sarah's death, tragic though it was, has shaped society and changed the way people behave. And don't forget, I've already mentioned the risk assessment model of paedophiles being released from prison changed because of Sara Payne and was then amended again after Sullen. So society is learning its lessons, doesn't bring Sarah back, but it must be some consolation to the family.
Tosh, you've been an incredible guest. Thank you so much for joining us on True Criminals and giving us a real look into Sussex Police's painstaking investigation and successful prosecution of Roy Whiting, putting him behind bars, at least for the next few decades. It's really been fascinating to have you with us. You agree, Martyn?
Absolutely. As we've said, I've known Tosh for a long time. He was incredibly helpful to me, him and other officers, during this very troubling investigation and my reporting on it. But today, after all these years, I've learned so many new aspects to the case. It's been fascinating, Tosh. Thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. First time I've done a podcast on Sara Payne. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it in the sense that they better understand the horror of the case, but also better understand the good things that came out of this case. And there are a lot of good things that came out. And our thoughts, as always, go to the Payne family, especially Michael and Sara.
Thank you.
Well, Martyn, Tosh was another extraordinary guest. I think you were quite surprised by some of the stuff he revealed in that interview, things that you didn't necessarily know. There's been an extraordinary aftermath and legacy from this dreadful murder of little Sara Payne, as Tosh alluded to.
Yeah, I can't remember a case where the aftermath has gone off in so many directions and had impacts on subsequent investigations, whether it's Sara's campaigning to let people have the right to know when there are paedophiles living in their area, or whether it's the prioritisation of forensic evidence that was crucial in this case. And also, of course, as we talked about with Tosh, the fact that Whiting had committed this terrible crime 5 years earlier, trying to snatch 3 girls, abducting one of them, leaving her naked after sexually assaulting her, and going to prison for 3 years and only serving half his sentence and being free at the time to kidnap and kill Sarah. It's extraordinary that something like that was allowed to happen. And of course, people are far more conscious of that now, and people don't get released early from prison in those kind of circumstances. So all of that has changed and is a very positive legacy from the tragedy of the Sarah Payne case.
We must talk a little bit about Sarah Payne's mum, Sara. I remember at the time, all those years ago, what an extraordinary force she was. She was always on television making media appeals, trying to keep the case alive, to try and find her daughter. You spent time with her, didn't you?
I did. I've interviewed lots of parents in similar situations where their child had gone missing, and some of them are very shy, too traumatised to speak at any length with journalists, but are often persuaded by the police and do this very reluctantly, do come on and talk and make appeals to the public for information. Sara Payne was absolutely extraordinary. I've never met anybody like her in these circumstances. She got it from the first moment that she needed, the family needed, to be very public and to ask for help, to ask for anybody who had information about their missing daughter. And I do remember how she was compelling, the whole family were compelling in their belief that they would find Sarah alive and she would come home. And there were some very emotional press conferences and interviews that we did. At the end of the trial, I remember talking to Sara Payne, along with other journalists, as the light faded at the end of that December afternoon. She stood on the steps of Lewis Crown Court and talked about her feelings on the verdict and what the whole episode had meant for her and the family. And somebody asked the question, what are your thoughts about Roy Whiting? And I remember Sara had the perfect answer. She said, I'm not thinking about Roy Whiting. She said, I'm thinking of my daughter, Sarah. And it was, again, another illustration of her incredible strength and grace. And she had exactly the right words. But after that, I've not had any contact with Sara Payne or any member of the family. And it does bother me sometimes that part of my job is to build relationships with victims' families. And we do sometimes become quite close, and we persuade families to share quite personal thoughts and moments with us. And then once the story, and it sounds terribly cynical to talk about a story, but once the crime and the criminal justice process is over, we part. And it does bother me that we lose that kind of contact. I haven't spoken to Sara Payne since that moment, those few moments on the courtroom steps at the end of the trial and Roy Whiting's conviction. And I suppose it does make me realise why a lot of people think journalists, crime reporters particularly, are sometimes thought of as being rather cynical. It's not cynicism, it's just the nature of our job.
And the nature of the police job as well, as Tosh so eloquently explained how they tried to look after Michael, Sarah's dad, and then once the trial was over, that wraparound, I think he called it, of the police taking care of everybody naturally has to fall away. They have other crimes to solve. And it was terribly sad to hear what happened to Michael and also what's happened to the children as well, and how losing his sister has caused a lot of pain and heartache for Lee too.
We can't possibly know the true impact on family members. We know about Michael, Sarah's father who spiralled into depression following her disappearance and then the discovery of her body. We know that he and Sara separated a couple of years after Sarah's murder. They'd been together for 18 years. He descended into alcoholism. He was jailed himself for an assault some years later. And in 2014, so that's 14 years after his daughter's murder, he was found dead at his home in Kent. A terribly sad part of the story. He is another victim of Roy Whiting.
And ending, as Tosh ended his interview, on a very positive note, it's extraordinary that Sara had the strength to carry on and campaign to get Sarah's law, clearly not wanting Sarah's death to be in vain.
Yes, I mean, I think it must be some great comfort to Sara, the fact that she had the strength to campaign and she did get the law changed. There is Sarah's law, which allows parents, families to get access to information about convicted paedophiles who are living in their area. So if you are concerned about somebody living nearby, particularly if you're a parent with young children, you can apply to the police and the police will make a judgment about whether to let you know whether there are convicted paedophiles living in your neighbourhood. It's changed the lives and given an awful lot of comfort and reassurance to, I'm sure, thousands of parents since Sarah's murder.
And final thought, you were sitting there listening to Tosh and quite a few times he said, I don't think I've ever told you this, Martyn. What was the most striking thing from Tosh's interview that was revealed today that you didn't know?
There were two things, I suppose. The fact that Whiting's first victim was sitting beside him throughout the trial, a little girl who was 9 years old and was kidnapped, sexually assaulted and left naked in a wood miles from home by Whiting 5 years before he murdered Sara Payne. I can only imagine what that must have been like for that young girl, who of course had grown up a little since then. But the fact that she was sitting through that trial every day when I was there and I didn't know it, what would I have done if I had known? I doubt whether we would have been allowed to draw attention to it, but it would have been good to know. But I suppose, and this is, it's more of a light-hearted moment, isn't it? The revelation that the police, when Whiting was released on bail, had a surveillance team watching him, but kept disappearing because he wasn't in a car that could be followed. He was on a bike disappearing into the country lanes around Crawley where he was staying, and the police found it very difficult to pursue him. So Tosh has explained to us now that he just told the frustrated surveillance team to use their initiative, and they did by stealing his bicycle. That's quite an extraordinary admission from Tosh, but it did the trick. It meant that the surveillance team could do their job and keep an eye on Roy Whiting all that time he was on bail.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.